All right, good afternoon and welcome everyone. So excited to see you all here in person. I know I've been counting down the days for this conference for over 6 months now, and it's been exciting to see the enthusiasm from the speakers who've come all the way out to swampy DC in the middle of July for such an event, and also to our institutional partners. So many conservative organizations came together to help promote this, which I think is a testament to the intellectual vibrancy of our movement. So welcome. Before we get started, I'd just like to say a few brief words about the Intercollegiate Studies Institute and also the purpose of this conference. ISI was founded back in 1953 with the mission of educating the next generation of American leaders committed to a life of liberty and public virtue. And we've been at that for 68 years now and graduated a number of prominent alumni from our programs, including Hillsdale College President Larry Arnn, Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch and Sam Alito, and the co-founder of PayPal, entrepreneur and investor Peter Thiel, and many more. Many of you might not know that when ISI was founded in 1953, we were actually called the Intercollegiate Society of Individualists. The Society of Individualists was created to counter the Intercollegiate Society of Socialists and to roll back the tide of liberalism and support for the New Deal on college campuses. It was founded by libertarian journalist Frank Chodorov's ideas, William F. Buckley Jr.'s energy, and J. Howard Pugh's money. He was the owner and chief of Sun Oil Company. And so ISI began in earnest promoting individualism on college campuses. We had a publication called The Individualist, and it began to grow. It partnered with the Foundation for Economic Education. And one day, the vice president, Vic Milioni, decided to reach out to Russell Kirk, the sage of Mecosta, to ask him to join the advisory board for the Intercollegiate Society of Individualists. Russell had just received the first issue of ISI's magazine called The Individualist, which he said, quote, shocked him. He responded, at first he ignored Vic Milioni, and then he decided to respond to Vic, and he said, well, Vic, the Intercollegiate Society of Individualists, and this is a direct quote, individualism ends in anarchy. Spiritually, it is a hideous solitude. I do not even consider myself an individual. I hope that I am a person. So this sort of struck Vic Milioni to his core because he respected Russell Kirk. And he said, well, Russell, what would you propose that we teach young people? And so Russell wrote him, if ISI had chosen for its pantheon Aristotle in place of Zeno, Falkland in place of Locke, Dante in place of Milton, Sam Johnson in place of Adam Smith, Ruskin in place of Mill, Burke in place of Jefferson, then you might succeed in capturing the imagination of the rising generation. And so Russell Kirk's influence in his recommendation was influential, and ISI would, within a couple years, expand the scope of its core programming to include teaching students about the roots of American order and Western civilization, going all the way back from Jerusalem, Rome, London, Athens, culminating in the Experiment in Liberty in Philadelphia. ISI would also change its name to the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and then Russell Kirk, who started Modern Age Journal in 1957, would become a frequent speaker for ISI, and Modern Age would become ISI's flagship publication, which today it's edited by the brilliant Dan McCarthy, and I would encourage you to pick up a copy of the latest issue, which is actually on the topic of political economy. So the influence of Kirk at ISI sort of introduced this synthesis and this tension between freedom and virtue and between liberty and order, and it's a tension that endures to this day. But if it is a type of fusionism, I know some people think that fusionism is a dirty word. It's an embodied fusionism. It's a fusionism with roots, in fact, roots that goes back well over 150 years before Frank Meyer wrote the book In Defense of Freedom. ISI's headquarters is actually located in the scenic Brandywine Valley, and the Brandywine Valley extends from Wilmington up into Chester County, Pennsylvania. And in the Brandywine Valley, the place embodied something called the Brandywine Paradox, which is really a prototype of fusionism, and it was really the DuPont family who brought that fusionism to the Brandywine Valley. They came at the behest of Thomas Jefferson. Alexander Hamilton drew up the contract for their land, and about a mile from ISI in one direction, they established what was really the seat of industry in the early American nation. It was a place of innovation, growth, entrepreneurial dynamism. They had paper mills, they had gunpowder mills, and the family actually put their home, their mansion, on top of the mills in case the mills exploded when the men were working. The house would also be consumed in the flames. So that was sort of their approach to economic dynamism and growth. But on the other side, about a mile in the other direction from ISI's headquarters, it was the seat of culture and tradition. And they preserved, they had wonderful gardens, horticulture, preserved literary, cultural, and gardening life. And it was very much a place of conservation and sort of a Roger Scruton-esque, picturesque, almost like an English countryside. And so these two things, tradition and dynamism, lived hand in hand at ISI and really infused the ISI student experience when we invite students to attend our conferences. And so it's with that spirit in mind, hearkening back to an older tradition, that we are here for our conference today on the future of American political economy. And the purpose of this event is to ask ourselves, how do we respond to the defining issues of our time? We picked 4 topics in particular, from big tech companies partnering with the federal government to silence the speech of Americans and also to exert their market share to get things that they want, from a rising China who threatens the United States not only militarily but also economically, and who uses their economy as a tool of their national security strategy, to families, which in many respects, the family from declining rates in marriage and fertility, and from a general sense that the hope of the American dream, that parents have less hope that their children will be able to experience the American dream than they did for themselves and their parents. There's a sense that the American family is in desperate need of being shored up. And finally, what to do about cronyism in the administrative state, something that conservatives have sought to roll back in one way or another for the past 100 years since the New Deal, but it just does not seem to want to go away. So if it's here, what do we do about it? How do we tackle it? So those will be the issues that we address this week. And I believe that fusions and realignments are not born from abstractions or ideological debates and discussions as much as concrete historic circumstances. And so we'll be looking at it through that lens. As Thomas Jefferson put it, the maxim to be applied will depend on the circumstances which shall exist. For in so complicated a science as political economy, no one axiom can be laid down as wise and expedient for all times and circumstances. So each of the speakers on the panels, I think, will bring a unique perspective. The speakers are encouraged to disagree, but not to be disagreeable. Each panel will focus on a very particular topic, but our first 2 speakers today will actually have been asked to lay the theoretical contours for the discussions that we'll be having. So Oren Cass will be taking up the American system tradition of Hamilton, whose political economy can be summarized in a couple sentences from his report on manufacturers, when he writes, "Every nation ought to endeavor to possess within itself all the essentials of national supply. The possession of these is necessary to the perfection of the body politic, to the safety as well as to the welfare of society." And he'll be laying out the American system tradition that really flourished in 19th century America with figures who followed Hamilton's lead, people like Henry Carey, Henry Clay, Friedrich List, and then it ended up being adopted as Abraham Lincoln's platform and the platform of the Republican Party really up to the Progressive era. And then we'll have Jay Richards respond and make the case for the classical economic tradition from Adam Smith to Thomas Sowell. And Thomas Sowell has a quote that I think is very apropos for this conference. Quote, "The first lesson in economics is scarcity. There is never enough of anything to satisfy all those who want it. The first lesson of politics is to disregard the first lesson of economics." So Jay Richards will be talking about the tradition that it goes from Smith to Ricardo to Say to Friedman to Hayek and to Thomas Sowell. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome both speakers up, and Oren will go first. Oren Cass is the Executive Director of American Compass, whose mission is to restore an economic consensus that emphasizes the importance of family, community, and industry to the nation's liberty and prosperity. He previously served as a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, domestic policy director for Mitt Romney's 2012 presidential campaign, and management consultant for Bain & Company. And Jay Richards was recently named the William E. Simon Senior Research Fellow in the Heritage Foundation's DeVos Center for Religion and Civil Society. He has been assistant research professor in the School of Business and Economics at the Catholic University of North America. A New York Times bestselling author, Richards is also a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute, where he works at the Center on Wealth, Poverty, and Morality. Please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Oren Cass. Thanks, Oren.
Well, thank you very much, Johnny. Congratulations on the incredible new logo, but probably even more importantly, this incredible gathering. I think it's extraordinary just to see the amount of interest in this topic today. And somewhat immodestly, I'd like to say that I'm truly the perfect person to kick this off, because I was, in fact, a political economy major. There are not very many places you can major in political economy. As far as I know, there's one. And so one grows up trying to explain to people, what on earth does that mean, that you are a political economy major? And I found a pithy definition that at least described my own journey to political economy, which is, well, it's like political science without all the reading and economics without all the math. Which is what drew me to it. But I think actually says something important about why it's so useful, which is that it's not theory. It basically posits the idea that politics and economics are inseparably intertwined, and that as a result, theory only gets you so far. I think of it sort of like there's the three-body problem in astronomy. Us social scientists have to content ourselves with a two-body problem, which is that our economic theories are never going to be all that good when politics keeps getting involved. And our political theories are never going to be that good when economics keeps getting involved. The constraints that are people and their politics will always limit the ability of an economic theory to predict the way the real world works. And the resource constraints that economics describes will always limit the ability of even the most wonderful political theory to describe how our world could work. And so in my mind, political economy, ultimately, it's the pragmatic art of understanding, of explaining, and trying to improve upon the way these forces are colliding to create the world that we actually live in. I guess I'd start by emphasizing then that there is no single truth of political economy. And as a result, that means there is no single truth of economics or political science either. I think the conceit of the economists in particular is that we have this set of equations which equal out and therefore must be correct. And that's not true. Honestly, even if you get to like the most simple things like supply and demand, well, surely supply and demand is actually true somewhat, sometimes. But if you take a look at a supply curve, it says the more of something that's produced, the more expensive it is to produce it. That's not actually our experience in the modern economy in many sectors, at least in the part of the supply curve that we're actually operating in. And so again and again, we find absolutely the intuitions of economics are useful. They are worth considering. They tell us useful things. But if we give them too much credence, we invariably end up, I would say, with the wrong answer. And so what you see, I think, if you look at the great economists over time, is that they weren't really modeling at all. The history of great economists is telling us about the world as it is at that moment. Adam Smith, at the moment when international trade was really actually becoming a phenomenon, was describing, and specialization for that matter, was describing how these things worked and how we could understand them. He wasn't drawing abstract equations of how things always would work. Karl Marx found out, gosh, in this Industrial Revolution, it's really not working so well for a lot of people. That's sort of an important insight as well, and we need to understand that better. And I think he brought forward very important insights on the limitations of the market to serve both labor and capital well. Early in the 20th century, Schumpeter is writing in a period of just extraordinary technological change that's disrupting everything that people thought they understood, and he's trying to explain what is that process. Keynes, I think, is maybe the best example of somebody who his own views change enormously over time, but ultimately his influence is in helping understand what on earth is going on in this international economy as we grapple with the shell of a gold standard, and then what on earth is happening in a Great Depression. How do we have this Great Depression? Why won't people's wages go down so they can all be employed again? And therefore, what should we do about it? And then you get to Friedman and Hayek. Friedman and Hayek are wonderful, important economists who ultimately were describing a narrow period in history where everyone was extremely worried about communism and markets in the West were working really, really well. And they brought a lot of important insights to the table. But I always highlight Hayek's speech, Why I'm Not a Conservative, in which he sort of confidently says that the self-regulating forces of the market will somehow find their proper balance. And the example he chooses among all others is that exports and imports will always find their balance. Now, he was writing exactly midway through a 20-year period where our exports and imports were almost exactly balanced. And that's sort of remarkable that they were, and he was trying to understand why. But to extrapolate from that that is how markets work and will always be the case, I think would be incredibly foolish. And so this is where I think thinking about Hamilton and the American system is so useful. What I don't think is useful is to say, well, this is how Alexander Hamilton did it, and as conservatives we must point to something in the past that is true, therefore Alexander Hamilton is true. That's not what conservatism means. That would not be a good way to do economics. But I think in looking back to Hamilton, to looking back to the American system, we are forced to ask a really interesting question of what is the American economic tradition? And then to realize that the American economic tradition is sort of anything goes. I mean, there are certain Enlightenment traditions. We have respect for private property. We obviously give a strong role to markets. But beyond that, you can really kind of look over the crowd and pick out your friends to find whatever economic philosophy you would like to hold out as American, going back from colonial Britain to the founding. Hamilton had a great American system idea that is not how the country proceeded through its early decades, to the actual American system, which really, after we got our rears handed to us in the War of 1812, really became of greater interest. The American system obviously was quite popular for a while. Teddy Roosevelt, I think, and the progressives bring in a very different view. FDR obviously brings in a very different view. And then the Reagan Revolution brings in a different view. And so it seems to me that in looking at Hamilton and the American system, the lesson is not, well, this is the best system for all times. It is that good political economy and good policymakers, like Alexander Hamilton, like the American system thinkers, in times when we had very successful public policy in America, like our first century, they were responding to conditions. They were problem solvers. I think the quote from Jefferson that Johnny started with is exactly right. They looked at the actual situation we had and asked, how can we use the tools of public policy to address it and to advance the fundamental ideals of the nation? And it's very funny, Wells King, who's out here somewhere, did wonderful research for us at American Compass looking at this tradition of the American system, and the most fascinating part is that it was in opposition to a British system. So you had Adam Smith and Ricardo, you had these folks who were not American and were writing from the perspective of how to keep and enrich your empire, essentially. And the American system guys very directly said, no, we see what you're doing here. We see why you'd really like us to implement this set of non-protectionist free trade policies. And if we were you, we would say the same thing. But that's not what America needs right now. And so the American system folks and the British system folks were in great tension. And the American tradition was not at all the Smithian free trade tradition. Now, fast forward 100 years, and it makes sense that Hayek or Friedman would be the ones who carry on the Smithian tradition because now America is the superpower. And now America has a different set of interests. But if we look at the challenges of today, they are just a different set of challenges. They're a different set of challenges than we've seen at any time in history. They're certainly a different set of challenges than Reagan and co. faced when they developed the Playbook that most, I would say, on the right of center are still frantically flipping through whenever they need a solution to something. And I'll just list a few. I'm actually delighted. I promise I wrote these down before Johnny started speaking, and the first four are the same four he mentioned, so we're doing well. Obviously, one is China. And I don't mean China in the sort of they have a million-person army and they're going to invade us sense, but I mean China is the most important geopolitical and economic event of the past 40 years. Having an authoritarian, quasi-communist, state-controlled economy as near peer, arguably becoming peer with ours, certainly in scale, and as our main trading partner. That's just a super interesting and different policy question than any of the economists any of us are talking about have ever actually tried to solve. Technology and big tech, I think, as an economic phenomenon is fundamentally different. I don't believe we've ever had a situation, you could debate the progressive era 100 years ago, where the most dynamic investment hoovering up industries were also ones that all tended to natural monopoly and massive rents. And the effect that that has on investment patterns, the effect that that has on economic, cultural, political power are extraordinary. And that sort of thing is what gave rise, of course, to trust busting and progressivism in the first place. That's not to say that that's the answer this time, but there's a similar, I think, rethinking that we need. Family, obviously, I think family typically belongs first on this list, and I should say they're in no particular order, which makes it matching Johnny's order even more remarkable, I think. But what on earth is happening to the family? If we're not getting family formation, if we're not getting children, that is an extraordinary challenge for a nation, again, that for the most part we've never seen in history, and that we need to address, and that we need to have a point of view on. Johnny said cronyism for number 4. I actually wrote finance as number 4, which is a little different. Cliff Asness might jump out from behind any corner, so I'll be careful about this one. But finance is not just another industry. It is a sort of horizontal slice of the economy that we rely on to bring resources to the place where they can be deployed well. And it is not doing that fundamentally in a way that I don't think we've seen before. We have a regional problem. We have a problem that we are not seeing widespread prosperity nationwide. We are seeing it concentrated in never narrower geographic areas. And if you just believe in efficiency, you might say that's great. There's actually an economics paper out there that shows how much higher GDP could be if everyone moved to San Francisco and New York, which to my earlier point is really all you need to know about the economics profession, I think. But gosh, if you want to have a nation, you're going to have to do something that counteracts that pressure. Education, I think, is an extraordinarily important one. We have, for a very long time, essentially placed an awful lot of our bets on just better educating people. There's an interesting phenomenon in China. How much of the growth can you explain by just moving people out of subsistence agriculture and into industry? And it's an awful lot of it. And as you run out of chances to do that, growth starts to slow down. I think you see a similar thing in America where for an awful lot of time, like extending primary education to a population that didn't have it is an extraordinary way to generate growth. Then doing secondary education is an extraordinary way to generate growth and really improve people's well-being. And so I don't blame anybody who said in the 50s or 60s, well, obviously the next thing we have to do is college for everybody. I understand that. But it has now been 50 years, and the share of the population that shows itself to be ready for college-level academics has not changed. And so there's a diminishing return there. And again, a need for, I think, a very deep rethinking of how we develop human capital and what we expect from that process. And then finally, the labor market. At the end of the day, how we allocate income to workers as a society through our economy is obviously central to most people's well-being and their families and their prospects. And that hasn't been going so well either for a very long time. I mean, I guess I'll continue doing the debate over whether wages are typically, technically flat or are they actually up 4% or whatever. It doesn't matter. As compared to the past, wages have stagnated for a significant share of the population. And that has very real consequences. And it's not because the economy has stagnated. GDP keeps growing, profits keep growing, incomes at the top keep growing, and that is not making its way down. And so again, that is in some ways similar to a problem we saw at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Unfortunately, the best person you'll find writing about that is Karl Marx. So we'd probably better do some more thinking on the subject, would be my conclusion. And for conservatives then, I think, the thing that we conclude, as I said, is not, well, let's just go find which decade in America's past we'll claim that we're trying to conserve, but it's what are the actual principles that constitute conservatism. I think you could make a long list. I'll suggest 4. One is a very heavy weight on the value of institutions and relationships, recognizing those as, in a sense, the basic unit and currency of the healthy society, and something that needs to be treasured and built and nurtured, even if you can't see or measure it in any meaningful way. Second, I think a recognition of the somewhat fixed nature of human nature and the skepticism that just because it would be nice if people behaved or thought or acted differently, we can cause that to happen. Third, an appreciation for what works and a recognition that even if you could design something really cool and better in a lab, getting from here to there is not easy and won't necessarily happen at all. And fourth, a balancing of the ideas of obligations and rights. I think one of the most obvious failures of the right of center in recent years has been this stampede into the direction of rights language and individual liberty, which are of course tremendously important and part of the conservative tradition, but they are a part of the conservative tradition. And it is a more important part of the conservative tradition to remember that such things need to be balanced. And so it seems to me that that kind of thinking has been absent from our economic debates since roughly the start of the post-war era. And I don't think conservatives are always right. I think it's very important to say that if we could just snap our fingers and everyone was a conservative and thought this way, we would have huge dysfunctions in our society. The healthy polity is one that has strong conservative and liberal traditions that are constantly in tension with each other and fighting and negotiating between them. But we haven't had the conservative tradition at all, I would say, in a very long time. We've instead had a fight between a very narrow swath of left liberals and right liberals. And I think you see the result today in huge gains in individual autonomy and material prosperity, and huge declines in the things conservatives probably would have been keeping a little bit more of an eye on. So I think I love the question, which way political economy, because it's also an answer. If you acknowledge that that's a question, that we have to decide which way for political economy, it acknowledges that there's a decision to be made, that it is something to be debated and grappled with and thought about in the context of this time. And so what is so important, I think, is to go through the exercise, that Hamilton went through, to go through the exercise that Clay went through, to go through the exercise that Teddy Roosevelt went through, go through the exercise that Reagan went through. And recognize that when Reagan and that entire cohort went through the exercise in the 1970s, the playbook they developed was incredibly important and effective. And nothing, certainly that I'm saying, calls any of that into doubt. What I call into doubt is that just picking it up and carrying it around like it's the Bible 40 years later is going to help us address the problems of today. And so I would say, work from those same principles, but throw out the old playbook. I considered throwing this across the stage at this moment, but that seemed ill-advised. But throw out the old playbook and recognize that the task for policymakers and all of us who work in various capacities to try to inform policymakers in every era is to apply whatever we think are the best available principles to the problems of that day and actually try to make something out of it that is useful, right? Public policy is going to happen. There are problems. Government is going to respond to them. And if your solution is, well, we really just shouldn't say anything, first of all, you're wrong. But even stipulating that you're right, it's not going to be effective. You're just going to absent yourself from the table. And so the question is, and again, this is why it's political economy, not political science, not economics, is how can we think about these problems and bring conservative values to these problems in a way that will actually equip policymakers to at least do better than they might otherwise? Because at the end of the day, that's all we can do. And so I think it's an incredibly exciting time. I think conferences like this and the agenda laid out here are exactly the right way to advance. And I would just emphasize that I don't think anyone has almost any of the right answers yet, let alone all of them. I don't have all the right answers, but gosh darn it, at least I have ideas. And we need a lot more. So thank you very much.
Well, it's great to be with you all, and so welcome to Washington, D.C. if you've flown in. This is sort of a kind of a representative sample day, actually, but I have to say I'm super excited about being in a room with 200 people and there are almost no masks. This is just sort of private excitement of my own, so I love being able to see your faces, and it's good to see old friends. Well, I should admit I'm in a slightly awkward position because was asked, Johnny asked me to essentially articulate this kind of intellectual tradition that we could call classical liberalism. I'm not really a classical liberal. I'm a standard issue American conservative, which makes me somewhat boring. But I actually think I sort of embody in my own thinking really kind of the ISI synthesis. And I myself, I've never actually been satisfied with the word fusionism, and in part because it makes sense if you're talking about a kind of a political strategy in which you bring people together for a particular end, try to get to 51% of the population, and you've got some people that are moral traditionalists, and you've got some Randians, right? There's always a couple of Randians. You can recognize them by the weird tie that they're wearing. And you want to bring them in, right? And then you get the military people, and you want us to all sort of work together, but you have fundamentally different views, not only about political economy, but about human nature and everything else. And I think Oren's exactly right. That sort of makes sense as a political strategy, but that's not a political philosophy, obviously. And I've never really found that satisfying because I actually think the American conservative synthesis actually works as a synthesis as long as you understand it properly and don't imagine it as somehow, taking Jesus and Burke and Ayn Rand and somehow sticking them together, right, and getting this sort of amazing synthesis. It's not going to work. I know a guy that has written a book about Jesus and Ayn Rand, and I thought, now that is a really that's kind of a tough nut to crack, and I don't actually think it could be done. And so what can I say in just a few minutes about this intellectual tradition that, as we framed it, we'll say from Adam Smith to Thomas Sowell? How can we distill this? This is an intellectually diverse group of people. And so this is the way I would explain it and the way I think we should try to understand and incorporate this intellectual tradition into the particular moment in which we're in. So Oren's exactly right. We're at a moment, right, in which there's in some ways a kind of refiguring of the situation. In the 90s, many people, including myself, sort of hoped China, if brought in to circles of trade, would liberalize and get a big middle class maybe, and the middle class would push for political representation. That didn't turn out so well, did it? And the reality is that China is now, in some ways, the hyperpower, or maybe one of two hyperpowers in the world, and quite obviously an adversary. And we have to figure out how to deal with that. That's a particular moment. But I would differ from Oren in that he described these sort of moments as creating different economic realities. And I think what is absolutely essential about this intellectual tradition from, this is artificial, but from Smith to Sowell, is that they believe there is an economic reality. There is an actual order, a segment of the world, just as there is a stable human nature. So the economy is that sort of slice of society, just a part of political economy, but think of it as a kind of a part of society, that part of society in which humans and individuals and families and firms buy and sell and exchange goods and services and information, often in the context of scarcity, something like that. And just as, in a sense, just as you would say, okay, what do we need to know about the physical universe? And we discover by careful study what the physical universe is, and there are these fundamental constants, and we eventually sort of figure out the periodic table of the elements. which is great because it's filled in. So we know, everywhere in the universe, it's the same elements. That's a reality. And so none of us would think I'm going to talk rationally about chemistry, but I'm going to ignore the periodic table of the elements. Now, obviously, the economy isn't like that, right? It's not chemistry, it's not physics. And in fact, I would agree absolutely with Oren that it's actually primarily not well described using mathematical formalisms. Nevertheless, this is the kind of fundamental question. Is there an economic reality that has its own principles, and are those discernible? Right? And that's actually the fundamental question. And I think that's the kind of insights, a way of understanding this intellectual trajectory that it crystallizes with Adam Smith. Most of the things that Smith talks about in The Wealth of Nations, he didn't originate. In fact, the kind of intellectual tradition that he represents reaches well back into the Middle Ages. So if you think Smith's just an Enlightenment figure, he's actually a lot more than that. But people often, I think, kind of misunderstand what Smith is about. And in some ways, what Smith represents is this shift from economics as purely a moral philosophy. Adam Smith was a moral philosopher. There were no economists. To this realization that there is a normative, a moral aspect to economic questions. That's what actually makes us interested in it. But there's also a descriptive aspect of economics. So that's this kind of fundamental question. Because you can't ultimately, if you're wanting to say, okay, well, should we restrict trade with China or should we expand trade with China? That's a sort of normative or moral question, I would take it to be. But part of the answer to the question, to really be able to answer it, don't you have to know maybe what would happen if we did that? Right? That's the distinction between the normative and the descriptive. And I think when economics is doing what it's supposed to do, and when economists are doing what they're supposed to do, what they're doing is they're helping us to uncover the perennial patterns of this aspect of reality, of economic reality. And a sort of simplified way of thinking of it is that when we're doing economics, we want to distinguish three basic questions. So let's take a really simple example, something like a policy. So let's say we're considering a policy. No one in this room would propose this, but there are some people I can think of that would say, let's raise the minimum wage to $50 an hour. Or let's say at $100 an hour, right? And then we'll all be rich, right? That sounds nice. I know no one's entertaining this, but it's kind of an interesting intellectual exercise. Here's the first question you want to ask. Now, the assumption behind that is that what happens when we're thinking about economics, if we're not careful to distinguish the normative and the descriptive, right? What happens is that our desire for the normative, what we want to happen, basically overrides the previous question, which is what would happen. And so that's really the first question, what? Right? So if we raise the minimum wage to $100 an hour, what would happen? That's in principle an empirical question. And in fact, it's actually really well understood. But let's imagine this hasn't been tested. That would be the question that we'd want to ask. And you could sort of run this, right? We wouldn't do this with humans, but maybe you could do a randomized controlled trial with different counties or something, and you could run it. And then you could just see what actually happens, what happens in the market if you do this. Now you could, let's imagine that you vastly increase the size of the black market and unemployment among a segment of the population. Let's assume that's what happens. But that would be merely empirical. We'd just say, well, this is what always happens when we do that. Why does that happen? Well, where economics comes in, and when it's doing its job, it gives us conceptual tools or theoretical tools for understanding, okay, why does that happen? Why is it that suddenly 14-year-old males all become unemployed and the black market explodes when we raise the minimum wage to $100 an hour? Well, and so economics, it turns out, has some really basic categories, a price theory and the relationship between supply and demand that in theory you'll learn right at the beginning that help you understand. If you kind of know what prices do, you know almost immediately why this is happening. I think this is something actually we know really well. It's because we're hard to formalize and to formulate, but this is really, really well understood, what prices do in the context of scarcity in this way. And so we have both, notice, kind of empirical knowledge in theory, right, that we can get from economics. So just as there are different periods of history in which maybe different political economies are called for, so we have the knowledge of history to tell us some things about what happens and what doesn't happen, what works and what doesn't work in particular contexts. So there's a sense, I think, in which economic knowledge can in that way, be cumulative. But notice that knowledge comes, as it does in any science, at the intersection of theory and observation, right? So it's not a kind of simple positivist thing in which we're just sort of observing data, but it can't also be entirely abstract theoretical constructs. It has to be the combination of those things. And I think, honestly, most of this stuff that's actually important, what I would call the kind of economic truths, the things that we can be quite certain are well understood, that we've discovered from studying and thinking about this, can be described in English prose that a sixth grader could understand. If you read Thomas Sowell's Basic Economics, there's not an equation in there. There's just no math in the entire book. And yet he managed, I think, very well to capture this. And because of that, or at least I'll frame it in this way, I'll frame it, if there are economic realities and truths, we want to know what those are, and we want to accommodate those in any political economy, right? So we don't want a political strategy or a political philosophy that's actually out of keeping with reality. We want to accommodate reality as conservatives insofar as we can. And so notice I mentioned two questions. There's the what question. What would happen if we do this? The theoretical question is why? Okay, why does this happen? And in theory, I think you can develop theoretical understandings that improve, that help us describe and understand what it is that's sort of happening out here in the world. And then you've got the normative question. What ought we to do? That's a real question. The positivists would have treated that as if, well, moral questions aren't relevant. No, in fact, that's the most relevant question when it comes to political economy when you're dealing with human beings. But notice that until you know something about the answer to the what and the why question, how do you know how to answer the normative question about what ought we to do? If you literally don't know what your policy is likely to do, on what basis would you advise it? And so that's why insofar as we can use the testimony of history and well-grounded theoretical understandings from economics, we should absolutely use those. It doesn't solve the normative question. It doesn't tell us, for instance, if we have some understanding about comparative advantage and the role of widening circles of trade and things like that and what's likely to happen and what's happened in the past. That can tell us some sense of what's likely to happen given certain trade policies. It doesn't tell us, though, if we should do that or not, but it should certainly inform it. The problem is that we very often, and conservatives are just as likely as people on the left to do this, is we allow our normative concerns to trump even the prior question about the kind of basic economic realities. And that's what I think is absolutely sort of crucial and important about this intellectual trajectory that we can start with Smith. And so what I think we have in Smith is this first kind of insight, that there's a difference between what happens in an economy and what we ought to do. And in fact, there's a disconnect sometimes between our moral intuitions about how things should turn out. I think that's Smith's key point when he says, it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, the baker that we should expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. He is not saying selfishness is a good thing. That is absolutely not his argument. But what he is saying is something that's kind of counterintuitive. But you would imagine that if people have kind of morally neutral or negative motives, that it's going to lead to bad things. And if people have good motives and are incentivized, and have good purposes, then it leads to good things. And so part of Smith's argument is that actually economic reality is sort of counterintuitive, so that sometimes people, if the incentives of the institutions are aligned properly, people can be pursuing their narrow, maybe morally neutral, but narrow self-interest, and yet still do something that benefits the customer. Right? And he even makes this more strongly when he is talking about this idea of the invisible hand, which he mentions, by the way, only twice. He says, in spite of their natural selfishness and rapacity, business people are led by an invisible hand and thus, without intending it, without noticing it, advance the interest of the society. Again, this is not greed is good, right? His point is that under certain kind of economic incentives, this is not anarchy. This is a system with the rule of law and private property and contracts and presumably a minimally virtuous populace. Even greedy people might even be doing something for greedy reasons, but actually in some way benefit society. That's counterintuitive, right? You could do something for a bad motive that could benefit someone, just as you could do something for a good reason that harms someone. And so notice there's this sort of a difference between both at the private level and the social level between the normative and the descriptive. And so that's why I think it's kind of the most important thing that we can get from Smith. And then, of course, we get the idea of division of labor and comparative advantage and the sorts of things that we're all sort of familiar with from Adam Smith. Those are sort of key insights, but Smith didn't have it all. And in fact, he was deeply confused about the nature of economic value. Smith had a sort of on-again, off-again labor theory of value that actually he shared with Karl Marx. And the labor theory of value sort of held on because it was an intuitive theoretical understanding about the nature of economic value. And it really was not until the early 20th century that this was kind of a clarifying moment, and we realized actually the nature of economic value, though labor under certain conditions can create economic value, value is different from the amount of labor that you put into something. It's in a sense intersubjective. And so what prices and supply and demand are describing is our private and personal evaluations, our subjective evaluations. And that created a theoretical insight that helps us to understand economic reality much better. In the same way that the general theory of relativity helps us understand certain things in physics better than Newtonian physics. It's an insight that built on that, but also transformed it. Now, again, I'm not saying that physics and economics are the same. In fact, I absolutely want to say they're not, because I'd hate to sort of confirm and encourage the temptation that what we really need in economics is something that looks like physics, right? To encourage this over-mathematicization of it. No, it's just that there are economic realities. You can think of them as sort of emergent realities or emergent phenomena, network phenomena that emerge from the activities of human beings under certain conditions. And insofar as human nature, as both individuals and intrinsically social creatures, insofar as that's stable and universal, then in principle we should be able to uncover stable and universal economic truths. We mentioned Hayek, but I think Hayek has a sort of crucial insight here in his analysis of the function of prices. That prices aren't sort of just arbitrary numbers, but they're in fact packets of information that in a market context and in a context of competition and scarcity, that prices will, under certain conditions, sort of represent and communicate certain underlying information that you could not otherwise get except for this market process. And it's because of that argument, which I think is a very powerful argument, the socialist planning is ultimately impossible, because you actually don't know what the price of something should be at any particular moment. A planner can't do that no matter how smart he is. It's only through the market process that you could actually understand that. And then the kind of key thing that, of course, is a perennial theme in economics that I think Thomas Sowell does so well. And it's simply that distinction between our intentions and the actual outcomes of policies. Here's one of many quotes. Sowell says, "Many of the seemingly compassionate policies promoted by the progressives in later years, whether in economics or in education, have had outcomes the opposite of what was expected. One of the tragedies of our times is that so many people judge by rhetoric rather than by results." Now look, I get the desire. I lie awake at night and I fantasize about Twitter and Jack Dorsey's company being utterly dismantled limb from limb, right? As much as anybody. I get the kind of emotional satisfaction of that. Nevertheless, we want to think carefully about economic policies and what they're likely to do, rather than spending too much time on what just seems sort of emotionally satisfying. Because very often, policies will be emotionally satisfying to us and allow us to be edgelords on Twitter, this is pointing to myself, but that actually make the problem worse rather than better. That's the irony of economics, is that very often the policies that we intend to help, like rent control, actually harm the people that we intend to help. And the reason is because there's just this stubborn economic reality out there that we can't change. What we want to do is we want to accommodate the pre-political realities that exist in human nature, institutions of the family, and religious communities, and this kind of market reality that slowly discloses itself if we analyze it very, very quickly. And so that's why I would say whenever tonight and tomorrow, when we're talking about these topics, when we're talking about big tech, we're talking about China, talking about trade, for all of us, let's I encourage us all, let's try to think about these things in terms of what would likely happen, right? Rather than thinking, well, you know, I'm really, really mad at Google, so what's the worst thing that I can do to them, right? Say, okay, what would this policy actually do, right? What would happen? I mean, it's a really simple thing, but just that simple question, and then what would happen? If we pause, it gives us a kind of a little bit of intellectual space to channel our passions by reason. And the good news is that so many economic policies have been tried in different places that if you look, you usually have a pretty good idea of what's likely to happen. It's just that we tend not to want to take on board those lessons of history when we're developing our economic policies. And so the arguments over, say, an industrial policy, if you oppose some industrial policy as a free marketer, your argument shouldn't be, well, it violates big government or Murray Rothbard didn't like it or something. Make an argument about why it would do something that's counterintuitive or destructive, right? They focus on that so that we're not sort of going at each other as to who's the Hamiltonian and who's the Jeffersonian, but rather let's try to focus on, okay, what's likely to happen in these cases? And I think if we do that in a room like this, right, where we're not on Twitter right now and we're not on CNBC, and so we don't need to posture. What we want to do is we want to come up with real solutions that I think can help us to forge a legitimate and a productive conservative synthesis. What I think we want to do more than anything is we want to avoid the temptation to reduce economic questions to either politics or ethics, while nevertheless insisting that those normative and ethical questions about economics are the ones we want to get to. But in all these things, I'd say let's try to master the art of economics, which is how Henry Hazlitt puts it in his great book, Economics in One Lesson. He said, the art of economics consists in looking not merely at the immediate, but at the longer effects of any act or policy. It consists in tracing the consequences of that policy, not merely for one group, but for all groups. And I can assure you that whatever our economic policies are, the wealthy billionaires will be fine. But bad economic policies hit the most vulnerable the most significantly. If you quadruple the price of food and you're only spending 1% of your income on food, it doesn't matter. If you're spending 35% of your income on food, it absolutely matters. And so we want to, insofar as we can, master the art of economics, which more than anything is simply thinking through the unintended consequences of policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Oren. So what we'll do is we'll give Oren a brief chance to respond to Jay. And while he's doing that, if you could pull out the ISI app, once we start the Q&A section, the first question we'll take through the app, and then we'll alternate back and forth between the stationary mics on the right and left side of the stage and the app. So, Oren.
Well, I think we have a lot to agree on, which is a great starting point. I guess I'll make one pithy observation and one more substantive one. The pithy one is I think it's really important to have concrete examples of, okay, where is it that economics is going to kind of give us an important insight, and minimum wage shouldn't be $100 an hour. Doesn't seem like it. Right. And so, I think at the extremes, as I said, obviously the economics gives you a useful heuristic for assessing things, but I don't know that we need it at the extremes. And so the question is, when you get to the question of, well, should we increase the minimum wage from $7.25 to $9.25 an hour? Well, what does economics tell us then? And obviously we have a lot of economists, particularly on the right of center, who would say, well, as you know from price whatever, that will lead to lower employment and it will hurt the least well off the most. But I love that quote at the end, economics is about thinking not in the immediate but in the long term. And I think that's actually exactly where economics ultimately fails, is that it analyzes the point in time quite well, but it has very little capability to actually think down the road about the consequences. Whether that's, well, how would the economy be different if minimum wage was higher? Or, well, what would the effect on our growth trajectory be if all of our industry moves to China? I think that's where economics really struggles. And then the second point that I wanted to make is just that I thought there was one I'd written down like, oh, I want to make this point, and then Jay made the point. So that's great, but I want to highlight it, which is the minimally virtuous population. And this is something that Adam Smith obviously is all over because he writes the Theory of Moral Sentiment before he writes The Wealth of Nations. But I think it's fascinating in analyzing how someone like Smith approached economic questions to recognize how centrally he is assuming things about people's cultural context. And that what it comes down to, he refers in the Theory of Moral Sentiments this idea that, you know, one of the key things driving people's behavior is their desire to be thought of well by others. And so that is, I think, what ultimately undermines this idea that he does somewhat espouse later of this kind of fixed economics, is that if everyone running around in the economic system, one of their prior, you know, key considerations is what everybody else thinks of them, and how we evaluate each other and our values and judgments of each other and how people assess that themselves changes, as it will over time, then I think our assumptions about how labor markets are going to function, how trade is going to function, how corporations are going to function, how people are going to pursue profit, all of these things go with it. And I do wonder whether we have a minimally virtuous population at the moment.
Any thought?
Oh, no, I thought
response to that?
response to the response. No, I think that's right. I mean, I think this is this kind of broader question is, I wanted to just sort of highlight this one sort of aspect that, and in fact, I think I'm much more optimistic that there are no, I mean, there's a reason that we know why the $50 minimum wage would not work. The reason I use the extreme is precisely because you understand it too. We understand what prices do. And so the fact that if you raise a minimum wage just slightly above the market price, its effects are hard to detect, doesn't change the basic reality. I don't think that that reality changes. I think prices function in the same way everywhere, as insofar as they're humans. For a political economy, and more precisely for a society, this is why I'm always uncomfortable with classical liberalism, because it treats political economy as a sort of abstraction in which I think that if you describe liberalism as limited government, rule of law, due process, right? Like sort of list these things. Those are all good things, but those don't just sort of exist in the Platonic heaven. In fact, as Lord Acton said, he's talking about this sort of higher liberty. He says, liberty is the delicate fruit of a mature civilization. It's sort of on a razor's edge. And so you're constantly in danger of losing that. And if a culture is not virtuous and it does not have virtue-forming institutions that are constantly infusing it, all of this stuff and all of these good things that we prize, I think, very quickly go away. Honestly, if Johnny had asked me what I wanted to talk about today, I actually wanted to talk about God and how we're totally screwed without God. That's actually what I wanted to talk about, because that's actually what I think we're dealing with here. And by the way, Charles Murray, the atheist, has said this. He said we need a third great awakening. I think that's exactly right. Nevertheless, I do think there are basic economic truths. And insofar as we could care about our fellow human beings, and especially the most vulnerable, we want to take account of those things that we have pretty good reason to think are true.
Great. Well, on that note, let's move on to questions. So feel free to line up at the mics, either on the right or the left. And the first question from Christian on the app. Do you believe that economic efficiency is a good analog for prosperity? Why or why not?
Is that to be first?
Whoever wants to respond.
I like it. It's almost like talk radio. It's like, all right, Christian on the app.
Yeah, exactly.
Long-time listener, first-time app question poster. I don't think economic efficiency is an analog for prosperity at all. I think first thing we have to say is how we define prosperity and recognize that material prosperity is a component, but not the only or primary component. And then when we are talking about material prosperity, economic efficiency certainly plays a role, but it doesn't play the only role. In the point in time, the most economically efficient arrangement will maximize the amount of stuff we have in all likelihood. But that doesn't mean that over time it will. And to Jay's point about the importance of institutions that instill values, if your economic efficiency undermines those institutions, which I would argue it is typically very good at doing, then in time too, you are going to find yourself with a lot less prosperity. So that's certainly not to say efficiency bad, but it is to say efficiency traded off against what, and what balance do we want to strike?
Yeah, I basically agree. I think economics, I mean, if you think about it, if you talk about someone economizing, usually what you're saying is they're thinking, okay, I have limited resources here. I want to use my resources in a way that's the most economical. In a sense, it's the most efficient. And so economics is really good for giving us that kind of analysis. But it's at best, it's a part of the story. I mean, let me give an example from, I don't want to steal thunder from later discussions, but immigration, for instance. So I think economics can tell us there's this kind of abstract way of analyzing immigration that, okay, if there's free flow of labor, labor will tend to go to its highest valued uses. So that's why a woman that could be a housekeeper in the Dominican Republic is going to make a lot more if she's here, even doing the same thing, right? That's true as a kind of an abstract analysis of labor. But of course, that's only part of the story because labor doesn't cross borders. There's not a thing called labor, right? There's people that cross borders. And so there are cultural and historical and social and religious issues that are involved. And so that's why I think the economic analysis, we want to get it as good as we can, but it is only a part of the picture. But I just want us to make sure in this kind of moment, kind of a populist moment in which there's, I think the temptation is to just trash this stuff, to say, no, it's why we call economics the dismal science, because it's like, oh, no, it's more complicated than that, right? But I think that we don't want to lose that.
Question over here at the mic.
Well, my name's Nancy Spanis. I wrote a book about Alexander Hamilton. And I wanted to do two things. One is I was hoping this would be more of a debate between Hamilton and Smith, because I don't know if people knew that Hamilton's report on manufactures, which I believe is the Rosetta Stone of his thinking, begins with an attack on Adam Smith, not by name, but by a different vision of what is possible in an economy. So it's not just pragmatic, right, is a place where I would differ with Oren a bit. He was looking, although he did do extensive surveys of what manufacturers existed in the United States, what the resources were, and so forth, as a econometric study, in effect. But then he said, no, what is being offered for free trade has provably impoverished every country that's done it, right? And that was the tradition that went on with the American system economists. And if I could, I would just like to read you a little bit of what was referenced in of the American system of Carey. Is that okay?
If you don't mind, if you could just keep the questions to a question, and we can, just for the sake of time.
Well, I wonder if you could have more of a debate about
argue a little more
about Hamilton's principles, not simply as a pragmatist, but a visionary for where the economy had to come because of economic realities. It had to develop as an industrial economy against the British free trade.
Yeah, so I'll jump in first on this one. I'll make some assertions that Jay can maybe angrily disagree with. But look, I think why Hamilton, the American system, is such an interesting kind of touch point and litmus test for these discussions is that a key point of Hamilton's was that domestic industry matters. That economic efficiency is nice, but even at the expense of economic efficiency and procurement of the cheapest things, domestic industry matters. And even at the expense of some amount of specialization and this and that, domestic industry matters. Partly it matters just from a national perspective for defending yourself, but it also has incredibly important implications for how your broader economy develops. I don't know that he made as much an argument about what it would mean in the labor market, but I would argue that's certainly a component as well. And so that is something that I think is true and that economics essentially can't see in the sort of way that Jay has been describing it. So I would assert that domestic industry matters, and in the trade-offs and the allocation of scarce resources, public policy should make trade-offs in favor of supporting domestic industry because of the benefits it's going to provide that markets and private actors pursuing profit cannot see and will not consider.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how, I mean, what economics brings to this is it can tell you what's likely to happen if you do these things. And so let's take it outside the American context, because this is the kind of thing that conservatives do, and that I don't like, is that we start having arguments about should we go with Hamilton or Jefferson, and I think actually we learn things, and so that's sort of an interesting question. But economics, for instance, let's take Japan, right? Now, I'm not a student of Japan, but assume that Japan is an island nation in which their cuisine is based in rice. Now, Japan might decide, okay, we want the domestic rice industry in Japan, even though it's a bunch of rocks and mountains, right? It's very suboptimal in terms of its comparative advantage for doing this. In fact, they would get much, much, much cheaper rice probably if they bought it from Vietnam. On the other hand, they're an island nation. Now, I think what economics does, and does very well, is it says, okay, you can do that. It's just that rice is going to be really expensive. But economics doesn't tell you one way or the other whether you should do that, because you might decide, okay, well, we're an island nation and we don't, we might get, a hostile army from China around us. And so we are going to accept that cost in favor of propping up a kind of industrial rice economy, even though it costs a lot. But so what I am saying is that what we shouldn't do is pretend that cost doesn't exist. I'm not saying that Japan would be irrational in doing that, any more than I would say that there might be reasons why we want certain industries here. It's just that there are basic economic realities we're going to have to deal with. There's no free lunch. And so if, in fact, it's not nearly your comparative advantage to produce something and somebody else could produce it much more cheaply, there's a cost that's going to be incurred. But economics doesn't tell you one way or the other whether you should do that. It just tells you that, okay, you're going to probably pay a lot more for rice if you do that.
Okay, but we've gone from the $100 minimum wage now to the quintessential comparative advantage basic agricultural product, which is fine. But the debate about domestic industry is the manufacturing sector. It's manufactured goods where by and large there is no comparative advantage beyond that which is created by the investments in the nations. And so if you're not talking about rice, if we're talking about, in the Japanese case, DRAM, the question is there a trade-off where investing in a domestic DRAM industry was a cost to the Japanese economy, or was it in fact actually a benefit to the Japanese economy that it made that investment?
Well, I think the same basic analysis applies whether you're talking about rice or steel or any of these things. It's still the same basic economic reality, and I'm not saying, that's why I said we might make the same decision. Now, I'd want to look at the details on particular manufacturing. I happen to think that the 20th century model of manufacturing with labor in a particular way of supplying things is in fact an artifact of the 20th century and will be gone both in the US and in China. But that's why the kind of details are complex. But I think the same basic economic realities apply. We might decide for some reason we want to preserve domestic steel industry or something. We'll incur a cost. Like, okay, maybe we need to do that for reasons, and maybe there's a national security argument for doing that. I'm just, for the sake of argument. Nevertheless, it will also increase the cost of domestic manufacture of goods that you steal. That's what economics tells us. It doesn't tell us we should or shouldn't do that. That's the normative question.
I guess want to maybe push a little further. I think maybe what Oren might be getting at is is there a scenario where there's a scenario of, okay, maybe for national security reasons, we limit trade, costs go up domestically. But I think kind of what maybe Oren and Nancy is getting at is there a scenario whereby when you actually restrict trade, develop the industry and the innovation here, where in the long run, costs and innovation actually go down, where there's not just a cost to the restriction, but an increase.
I'd want examples of it.
That's what I'm posing. That's what
I'd want examples. I mean, I use steel because that is a very specific thing that happened, right? It seemed to make sense intuitively with steel, and it drastically increased the cost of domestic manufacture. So is that a good policy? We preserve steel, we save 5,000 jobs in manufacturing. If it kills 30,000 jobs in manufacturing that uses steel. I mean, just making numbers up, right? But that's the kind of thing that economics presses upon us. It doesn't give us the answer, but I think if we take the economic reality seriously, it forces us at least to see the dilemma properly.
Yeah.
Right.
And
Well,
so,
how-
Oren, do you have? Can you give a concrete example?
Sure. Taiwanese semiconductor industry. Do you think Taiwan would be more prosperous in just an absolute economic resources sense if the government had not invested heavily in developing a domestic semiconductor industry?
I honestly don't know. Maybe not. Yeah, maybe not. The problem is we don't, in this case, right, we don't exactly have the counterfactual. And so that is why we end up relying on our kind of theoretical understandings of economics. And so what we need, of course, to test this would be right two Taiwans. And so the best thing you can do is sort of compare different countries,
Right, but
compare sort of those kinds of industrial policy. Maybe there are specific things. Maybe in the long run, it turned out well. But at the very least, we want to look at the devils in the details. And that itself, I mean, you're presupposing your own kind of knowledge of economics, I think, in that particular case.
I think it's a little bit unfair to say, well, we need to see concrete examples, but no concrete example is valid because we don't have the counterfactual.
No, not at all. I didn't say it wasn't valid. Did I say? I didn't say it wasn't valid. I said that we can't know for sure. And in fact, the first thing I said is it might be. It might be. That's the first thing I said.
Well, on that note, we've got another question from the app. This one's from Nathan. What is government's role in pushing the private sector to innovate when companies are too risk adverse to invest in R&D when returns are too uncertain? Isn't this the core of industrial policy?
I think Jay should.
Can you read it? I didn't
So
hear the very.
the question is, what is government's role in pushing the private sector to innovate when companies are too risk averse to invest in R&D?
What? Yeah, and so I mean, it's such a sort of broad, abstract question. My general instinct is that what you want is you want the government to create an environment in which private industries can innovate and can compete with these things, but that government's not in any particular position to be able to sort of guess ahead of time how this ought to go. The problem is that government tends to, I mean, honestly, I think this is one of the greatest things that Donald Trump did, and he doesn't get a lot of praise for it, was to partly dismantle the kind of hostile regulatory regime that we have for these sorts of things. But the reality is, I think there's a limit to what government can do in these kinds of things and guessing these things. I think there's a discovery process. That's the nature of the entrepreneurial process, is that it's a discovery process in which there's successes and failures. And so you want a lot of those tests, and you want government to provide an atmosphere and a sort of stable basis for that. But I don't think in general that, you know, a government agency is going to be any better off. And in fact, I think generally what you want for the incentives to align properly is that those that are most likely to benefit from a particular bet are also those that suffer as a result of the bet. And so the danger with having, you know, government sort of decide these things ahead of time is that you end up, unfortunately, a kind of cronyist situation in which you privatize profit and you socialize debt. That's the general worry. But, you know, I mean, the devil's in the details, obviously.
So can I just ask, so would you like defund the NIH?
Well, that's an interesting question at this point after COVID.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me think about that, actually, and get back to you.
Well, that's pretty much my answer to the question.
Yeah. No, yeah. I actually do think, though, I don't think there's any kind of realistic way of, just like I would love to dismantle the Department of Education. I'd love to do that if I were a benevolent dictator. I don't know there's a realistic kind of political way to do that. I do think that big science has a way. In fact, I wrote a master's thesis on the philosopher of science, Michael Polanyi, who was a critic of the way in which centralized bureaucratic science tends to distort the discovery process. And I do think that's a dilemma. Now, I think there's probably things that wouldn't get funded otherwise, but I do think that we would have, in fact, we'd be discovering things a lot better if science itself were slightly less centralized and slightly less bureaucratic.
Yeah, I just want to make one other quick comment. So look, I think government funding for R&D is incredibly important, both empirically because it has proven to be incredibly important in a host of areas, but also just from like the pure sort of pointy-nosed economist perspective of the market failure here. I mean, there are massive externalities to research, putting aside the sort of risk profile that even things that are in corporations' interests, I would argue they're probably not going to invest in. There are huge social benefits to research and innovation that are not captured by the firm. And the funny thing about this is that it's actually the market fundamentalists who like to make this point the most, because they want to emphasize that, oh, well, Jeff Bezos is worth $150 billion, but actually his social value has been like $5 trillion. And, there are these economic studies that say, only 2% of the innovation is actually captured by the innovator. Like, fine, stipulate that that's true. That only underscores the extent to which private parties are going to underinvest in innovation. And so even if you had total confidence in economics as a mechanism for evaluating these policy choices, I think that, if anything, would only strengthen your conviction that we should be just flooding the zone with investments in innovation, with the recognition that most of them aren't going to pan out, and that's fine, because the ones that do more than make up for all of the other failures along the way.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect formula for the crony capitalism that we have.
Which is the subject of the next panel. Question over here on the left.
Thank you very much. My question is on something that is talked about a lot, but interestingly wasn't really mentioned here once, I think, and that's the subject of identity in our discussion on the political economy. So this is clearly a neo-Marxist concept. Over in Europe, they're focused mostly on class. Here we focus on things like race and gender, sexual orientation, all that stuff. And my question is, do you think that identity should play a role? I'm not asking if it plays a role, because it does play a role in our discussion, in our policy development, but should it play a role in our development of our own conservative ideology? And if so, why? And if not, how do we eradicate it from not just our own conservative bubble, but also the American public? And how do we look at political economy without that? And if you can, as a bonus question, I would love to know, what do you believe is the best way of integrating our language and our lexicon into the leftist lexicon? So if, because they got us talking about identity politics, if we can get them talking about traditional moral values and free market, I would be in awe. So, but I don't expect you to answer that question, but if you can answer the first, I'd be very appreciative.
I have a couple of thoughts about this. So I think it's a great question, and I think it's important to recognize that identity is really important to people. And there's a certain sort of right libertarian, we shall transcend the bounds of identity and all be individuals, which is just totally impractical, and I think especially dangerous to the extent it renounces the importance of the nation as a form of identity. And so it seems to me the question is, well, what kind of identity do we want to emphasize? And that is a political economy question. There are some types of identity for a nation to focus on that are going to feed exactly into the institutional values that and the virtuousness of the people even that Jay was describing, and are an absolute prerequisite to not just a healthy democratic politics, but I would say ultimately a healthy economy as well. And unfortunately, I think one of the real weaknesses on the right in, for instance, this critical race theory fight is we're really good at pointing out what's stupid. And then we sort of say, like, boom, right? Like, mic drop. And I think it's hugely important to be advancing a compelling alternative and say, no, here is how we want to talk about identity for people, parts of which, by the way, aren't going to be our preferred national identity. People do care about their gender identity and their racial identity, and you're not going to wipe that away. So how do we construct an actually cohesive and coherent approach to identity that is actually conducive to a functioning nation? I think we have a lot of work to do there.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I guess the way I think of this is that there are truths of identity that has to do with our embodiedness and our historicity, right? So our national identity is a real thing, and in fact, I think this is an almost entirely positive move to refocusing on this. I mean, I'm deeply skeptical of World Economic Forum and all these kind of globalist organizations, and I think we need to kind of reassert our national identity. I also think our national identity is a unifying thing that also it prevents tribalism, ironically. If we're fellow Americans, then our ethnic diversity and our religious diversity gives us an identity that transcends that. without wiping it out. The problem with identity politics is that you've got an entire kind of philosophical superstructure involved here. And so just to take the transgender thing for a moment, right? It's such an intense and highly subjectivist understanding of identity that your sort of subjective perception of yourself can trump mammalian biology, right? That's what we're talking about right now. Now, I would say one of the kind of objective aspect of our identity is that we're mammals, right? But there's actually a particular philosophical view that's now rife in our culture, which says, no, actually this kind of this isolated and subjective self-identity can actually transcend and trump all of those things. And so this is the problem, is that, of course, the word identity is ambiguous. And so first thing you want to do is say, okay, what are we talking about? But I do think that's why it makes it so dangerous, is I think because we're not just talking about kind of ordinary identities. I'm Presbyterian and I'm from Ireland and that sort of thing. We're saying, no, I'm actually, to just sort of say what I read, I'm a furry, right? Which I didn't know what that was until this morning. I just read it on my phone, right? That's a new thing as of last week, I guess. And so I would say we want to be very careful in how we appropriate that kind of language. We want to assert, I would say we want to assert the things that bring us together and that make us distinct as a people, right? That's the point of the political economy, but without sort of in some ways trying to appropriate something that I think is a poison pill.
And what is that thing we're asserting?
What is that thing we're asserting? Well, I think for political economy, it is the specific details of the American experiment, which is not just an idea, but is also a contingent sort of historical reality.
So we're united by an idea, you'd say?
Both, no, not just an idea. I would say the particularities. That's why I think the kind of importance of the founding, you can think of it as a kind of founding mythology, is important. I think it's important that Americans know the story of the Mayflower, right, for instance, that helps define us in a kind of narrative frame, so that it's not just the abstract principles of the Declaration of Independence. It's the kind of historical situatedness of the fact that we are this nation and not another nation. I think that's a kind of an important inflection for the conservative principle, and the conservative frame of mind is distinct from the classical liberal frame of mind.
And since we have about 10 minutes left, we'll take 2 questions at a time. So if first 2 people in line over here would like to go.
Yeah, hey, Walt Hudson. I've written on geoeconomics and teach it a little bit. You know, there was an honorable liberal named Albert Hirschman, and he talked about how the conservatives roll out what he called the perversity thesis. They constantly say the worst is going to happen if this policy is enacted. Well, don't you think the conservatives should sort of point the cannon on themselves when it comes to conservative activism, economic activism? I'm thinking of 2 examples. Shareholder value is exemplified by Milton Friedman, which I think one could argue has had a disastrous effect on the American economy. Secondly, stock buybacks, which were illegal until the 1980s, which have just caused, I think, corporations to fleece their own pockets. If conservatism is built on empiricism, shouldn't there be an empirical study to show or not show that these things have had a good or bad effect on the American economy and the American worker, and not just rely on market fundamentalist theories and neoclassical philosophers that lived 100 years ago? Tendentious question. Thanks.
Yeah. I mean, I'm all for the kind of empirical analysis of these things. And corporate governance is what, the details of corporate governance is not an eternal verity. I think it's very inexact. And I think we learn things sometimes the hard way in terms of corporate structure and these sorts of things. And so I think those are sort of always open to revision and to refutation.
Well, this is something I jotted down as sort of, I think, the key example of why economics is not fixed. It's very funny, actually, to look back at, and Friedman as a product of the moment, the shareholder capitalism essay, the duty of the business is to make profit, or whatever the title was. It is prompted by Friedman's frustration that business leaders too embedded in their own communities are making too many decisions for the good of other stakeholders and not just focusing on profit. For all I know, that was true in 1970. And it was important to say, hey guys, you're kind of here for doing the profit-making thing. But the degree of embeddedness or not of business leaders in their communities is going to be a central driver of how well our capitalist system works. Adam Smith had one set of assumptions about it, Milton Friedman had another, and today we're in the world where the typical worker is employed by a business that is owned by essentially no one, because it is owned by a set of institutional investors who are holding money for a set of global private investors, none of whom know or care what they own. Every single person in this room, if you have a typical retirement account or something, you own a company that went bankrupt last year. You don't know or care. In fact, you're glad all those companies levered up to the point where some of them went bankrupt, because your risk-adjusted returns across all of them were therefore higher. But I can guarantee you the workers who cannot spread their jobs across 50 companies care. And that's just a different world. And if we think that the sort of way Adam Smith or Milton Friedman approached economic questions is going to get us through it, I think we are in for disappointment.
We'll take 2 questions here. Brad, go for the first one.
Okay. Yeah, Brad Littlejohn, Edmund Burke Foundation. So this question is primarily for Dr. Richards. You tried to frame this classical economic tradition in terms of empiricism, trying to actually discover what is economic reality. But there was, I think, a key line there where you said, insofar as human nature is stable and predictable, economic reality can be stable and predictable. And it seems to me that an authentically conservative empiricist approach says, yeah, but what if human nature isn't stable and predictable in the same way? I mean, you said it's not like the periodic table, but I would say it's really not like the periodic table. And so my question would be, if in fact this classical economic tradition from Adam Smith, Thomas Sowell, is empirical, then why is it that when behavioral economics came along and started asking, well, what do human beings actually do? Right. What do human beings actually want? That the conclusions in many cases seem to fly in the face of what classical economics predicted.
Yeah, it's a great.
Real quick, first we'll get to the second question and then we can.
I'm going to forget this question.
It was a great question. I'll throw it back at you if I have to.
Okay.
Sure, I'll make this quick. I really appreciated bringing up political economy and how we're bringing together 2 fields to come up with something very valuable. Ultimately, though, political economy is not our end, right? Human flourishing, virtue is sort of, our end as humans. So the question, I guess, becomes, to what extent does political economy and whatever we decide is the answer to a political economy serve virtue, serve human flourishing? To what extent do we just need God maybe? And does that virtue and human flourishing have to come first and then sort of fill in the gaps of the limits of political economy? Which direction does it go? Does it go both ways? Where do we start?
Why did you have us? Those are 2 big questions to hold in head.
If you want to take the first one, I'll take the second one. And then you
Okay,
can pick up on the second one.
so let me sort of describe my understanding of kind of the discovery process for economics. It's not a simple empirical one. I remember I said very quickly that discovery in any particular science, and I include theology under my understanding of science. So this is a capacious, non-positivist understanding. It takes place at the intersection of observation and theoretical sort of categories, right? And so it's constantly being revised. And so insofar, now the behavior, I've spent a year in 2014 studying behavioral economics, and there's actually some really important kind of empirical findings that I think, sort of call overly abstract theorizing in economics to account. I also think there's a lot of stuff that's very much oversold, because what grad students do in a lab is not necessarily all that sort of revelatory about what happens in a market. Nevertheless, what I would assume has happened is, if there is a human nature, and it is real and it is out there, and there are these kind of emergent orders in economic reality that we grow in our understanding and our knowledge of that over time. But what we want is a kind of open philosophy of science in which we're open to the data. And the data is going to include both our kind of understanding of human nature and also sort of our historical observations. And now, actually, even these kind of behavioral economic experiments insofar as they weigh on this. So it's not a kind of simple, naive positivism. It's this dialectical relationship of increasingly, I hope, increasingly accurate theoretical categories and our observations, which, if they're right, they sort of reinforce each other, and if not, they don't. That's my view on it.
So on the flourishing question, it seems to me that the definition of flourishing, relatively speaking, is, I'm going to say relatively speaking, it's fixed. As compared to a lot of the things we're talking about, it's quite fixed, though it varies by ideological outlook. There's sort of the, well, we want people to be happy and live good lives level, at which pretty much everyone's on the same page. You've got like some weird Randians and some weird, anarcho-communist somethings who have like really crazy ideas. But everyone else is like, look, we want people to be happy and live good lives. Down one level from that, you start to see real divergences between progressives, libertarian, conservatives about what that is, because life is full of trade-offs. So to what extent do we want liberty at the expense of, groundedness and place, and so on and so forth. And so, but I think generally speaking, a healthy political philosophy is really built around a quite constant conception of flourishing. And what changes is then, okay, given the world as it is, technological change, cultural change, political change, what kind of political economy do we need if we are going to achieve that kind of flourishing?
Right. Oh, go ahead.
Is this telling us
This
what
is
time we have?
telling us
Okay,
how much
Okay,
time we
so
have.
now that
and it's counting down.
I agree with Oren wholeheartedly. I was wondering in that second question, and I can't see you guys, so I'm sorry, but if there was a question about how much the state should do in terms of helping us to instill virtue, was that a part of the implication of the question? Was that an integralist question? Yeah. Yeah, no, exactly. And I think it's not sort of easily answered. And so I would say at the very least, our political economy in the state should not undermine virtue-forming institutions, right? That is an absolute minimum. So it should not do things that are, the way I understand this is that there are social realities and institutions that have their kind of proper role, but they're not all supposed to do the same thing. And so the federal government has a particular role to play, but it's not the same thing as motherhood, right? And it doesn't do the same thing as a religious institution ought to do. And so I think the primary institutions for virtue formation are family, neighborhood, church and religious institutions and voluntary institutions. And the nation state should not undermine that and will not survive without a virtuous populace. But I don't think it's its primary responsibility. But at the very least, it should not undermine it. And just that rule actually gives you a lot to do, because it turns out that government policy very often does undermine the virtue-forming institutions. And so even if you take that highly minimalist kind of libertarian view of the role of the state, there's still a lot of work to be done.
Right. So we've got 1 minute and 10 seconds. So Bryce and Wyatt, get your questions out there. We'll see if they can get a quick response to you, and then we'll jump to the break. Bryce?
Okay, Bryce, I'm a fellow for American Statecraft at American Moment. So my question is on the basis of a possible economic crisis, even if you don't necessarily believe that might happen, maybe treat it as a hypothetical. So there's been talks that there could be an inflationary economic crisis coming up, and last time this happened, it kind of ushered in a Reagan revolution where I would argue was more classical liberal, government is the enemy, not your friend. Right. If that happens and the GOP as it stands decides to take that retreat back into that mindset, what is the conservative response to an economic crisis where you might blame it on government spending or government attempts to help families?
Wyatt?
Hi, I'm Wyatt. This is sort of an ancient political economy question, but can Republican, or sort of we might call it in modernity, bourgeois virtue exist in a polity of wage earners? Must the majority of the polity be productive property owners in order for a republic to continue to function?
We're out of time. What do we do?
All right.
Let's
say
good questions.
guys.
Great questions. Yeah.
2 minutes. Go.
Okay. Yeah. Well, no, I mean, I think that virtue can be formed in there was virtue in the Athenian democracies, right, which were basically slave states. And so I don't think you necessarily, one particular kind of economic arrangement is uniquely suited for the development of virtue. I think that kind of general insight that you want the ability to acquire private property it's a foundational idea of the American Republic, I think, and of stable government. And so that kind of broader idea, I think, is absolutely crucial and a part of the American conservative consensus. But I don't think, the reality is that sometimes, if you've read the Gulag Archipelago or One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, right, is that sometimes torture is a really good school for virtue. So I honestly, I think that virtue forming can happen in almost any context.
Well, very quickly on the economic crisis, I think the situation today is very different from the 70s in that you have what appears to be runaway government spending potentially producing the inflation, which is different than we had then. I think it will be an interesting and awkward challenge for the existing Republican Party that it has been an eager participant in that. So that's not to say they're not going to turn around and say, well, obviously what we need to do is cut government spending. Among other things, if we get into an inflationary crisis, we are going to have to cut government spending. But in terms of the set of steps we can take from there, it seems clear to me that, well, what we need more is more tax cuts. It's not going to be plausible. And I think that's one of the fascinating things about the expiration of the 1980s consensus is at some point you run out of taxes to cut. I mean, we're down to raising like 16% of GDP from taxes at the federal level, and not only is it not accomplishing what we are told it will, you can't keep doing that, and you certainly can't offer it as a solution to a challenge of excess federal deficits. So I definitely think there's a chance of backlash in the event of an economic crisis, but I think as we saw in the pandemic also, the specifics of a crisis matter a lot and tend, frankly, to expose the kinds of things we're doing wrong, which at the end of the day, we are very fortunate for.
Great. And on that note, thanks, Oren. Thanks, Jay. We'll take a 10-minute break and see you back here.